2, 1.
Hello, this is Gerard Perry for Books, Music, and News Review, and today we'll be discussing a book written by Pastor Greg Laurie, a biography of Johnny Cash entitled The Redemption of an American Icon. And the interesting thing about this biography, it's structured in terms of chronology. It's structured in a very standard format. It starts with the humble beginnings of a country and American musical legend, his upbringing in rural Arkansas, a shack in Dyers, and progresses all the way through his stint in the United States Armed Forces, and all the way through his legendary career, the apex of his career, and then the gradual dissipation because of abuse of drugs and alcohol, and all the way up until the resurgence because of his collaboration with Rick Rubin, and finally his death. So in terms of chronologically, it's a pretty standard biography, but it's written as a spiritual biography of Johnny Cash. So it describes the evolution in his relationship to Jesus Christ and uses scripture repeatedly to illustrate the problems that he faced and when he decided to move away from Jesus and to pursue his own interests. And it's backed up with the heart of Scripture, and also some additions from apologists like C.S. Lewis. So, for example, when in the chapter "The Wanderer Comes Home," he describes the temptations that Johnny was facing. And he says, C.S. Lewis summed it up this way: all the things that ever deeply possessed your soul have been but hints of heaven, tantalizing glimpses, promises never quite fulfilled, echoes that died away just as they caught your ear. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in the world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy, but to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. And he goes on to say, God was not done with Johnny Cash. As Cash came to an end of himself, he also came to the beginning of God. And this was a point in Johnny Cash's life that he arrived at repeatedly throughout his adult life, trying to pursue the pleasures of sin and realizing that it had led him to a dead end. One of the most critical points was when he found himself in a literal cave, walking into a cave until he couldn't remember how to trace his steps back, and decided to just lay there and hope that he would eventually die. And of course, there was an almost miraculous or supernatural intervention when I believe June Carter Cash and members of his family remembered where he went, and actually traced him back, and he found his way out of the cave. And it sort of represented the nadir of his spiritual walk. He had immersed himself in drugs, and the interesting thing about that is Greg Laurie actually discusses how that began when his music career started to take off. His big break was him and Luther Perkins and the Tennessee Two opening up for Elvis Presley on Elvis's Hayride, a local tour throughout the South. And in order to keep himself awake in driving these long distances between different cities for these concerts, he decided to use amphetamines in order to keep himself awake at the suggestion of one of the other musicians. And this was something that he became addicted to and the addiction lasted on and off for decades, to the point where at one point in his career he was 150 pounds, which Greg Laurie describes this, for his frame, that was almost anorexic. He was consuming 90 to 100 of these pills within a week, an average week. So it focuses on Cash's physical and mental, but most importantly, the spiritual struggles with these addictions and these vices that he couldn't detach himself from, but also the interventions of his family, the people who loved him. His mother, Carrie Cash, who instilled much of the values that he had throughout his life, particularly the reliance on God and esteem of the Bible, even when Johnny Cash was careening over the edge and indulging in all of these destructive behaviors that were injurious not only to his career but also to his life. He still hearkened back to God and remembered how he had been raised, and the value of relying on Jesus Christ. And the Laurie biography is interesting because of the focus not only on the spiritual aspect, but Johnny Cash's appeal to the popular culture. One of the things that Greg Laurie intended to do with this biography is to convey the importance of God to someone who was a musical and a cultural icon. As it says in the title, the redemption of an American icon. This is really the redemption story of someone who became the focus of mass adulation within the country, not only within country music, but also pop music in general. He points this out throughout the book, how at the height of his career, his songs would chart not only on the country and the Americana and folk charts, but also on the pop charts. At one point, he was the most popular musician in the country, and he was even able to host a short-lived TV show, which was the most popular variety show on American television, where he not only had diverse music acts, but also had gospel acts, and was able to preach, in a sense, to an audience of tens of millions of people. And the fact that he had that type of celebrity, that he could go against the network censors and the network executives who weren't really interested in having the gospel share, but were rather interested in simply having a ratings bonanza and helping their network be number one. The fact that he commanded the sort of cultural cachet to do that really speaks to something in Johnny Cash's life, and that he had the character to actually go through and impose his will and do this in spite of all of the adversaries that he had. It's really an interesting, fascinating story, and Greg Laurie has done this before with Steve McQueen, who was an iconic movie star in the 1960s and 1970s, and he had another best-selling biography of Steve McQueen. Although his story was was different from Johnny Cash, because he repented very late in life, after he had already become a national and international movie star, and retired because he was sort of sick of Hollywood, and he retired at the peak of his career, which is something you don't see that often with celebrities, particularly film stars, famous actors. You don't see them very often reach the pinnacle of their career and then decide to walk away, which was what Steve McQueen basically did. And in that 2 or 3 years after his retirement, he realized that what he was searching for was a relationship with God, not all of the things that he had done up to that point. Because Steve McQueen was an orphan in a sense. Johnny Cash, and Greg Laurie describes some of the differences in their life. Even though the unifying factor relationship with Christ was there, they had very different material circumstances, and especially growing up, Johnny Cash, as I said, he had a strong relationship with his mother, who tried to instill these values in him that he would remember later on in life. So, but the Steve McQueen biography was part of this series that Greg Laurie is working on to try to highlight the cultural impact of Christians who are in the public spotlight, people who are considered or were considered these iconic celebrities who had access to untold wealth and advantage and power, and yet they still found that lacking in some way. They decided that they needed a real connection to God, and when they realized that they had a conviction of sin, that they needed a relationship with Christ, they became public exponents of the gospel. And the difference between McQueen, of course, was he found this rather late in life, and one of his regrets was not being able to share the good news with everyone, because he found Christ less than a year or year and a half before he ultimately died from terminal cancer. And in fact, in this book, Greg Laurie makes the connection to Juarez, which was one of the last places Steve McQueen was seeking treatment for his cancer before he died. And it was also the city that Johnny Cash returned from when he entered the U.S. and was arrested for trying to smuggle in hundreds of bottles of dexedrine and other amphetamines. And that was sort of the low point, the nadir of Johnny Cash's life up to that point, and spurred him to try and discover what was wrong. And the thing that was wrong was that he had severed his relationship with God. He had kind of drawn away and pursued his own addictions and interests to the exclusion of God. So he makes that connection. But Greg Laurie, the series itself is interesting. The idea that Christianity should not be divorced from public life. It shouldn't be kept away. And he brings this up in the book, the fact that in the gospel, Jesus says to not hide your candlestick under a bushel, to not hide your light, the light that comes from Christ, not to hide that from the world. You shouldn't join some monastic cloister or separate yourself from the broader culture. You should seek to influence it through your own life example of how Christ changed your life and what he brought to your life. And this is something Greg Laurie was attempting to do through these biographies to try to show America that Christ is not something that's reserved for people in it's not reserved simply for people who go to church once a week or twice a week, and for people who are super Christians or just the kind of stereotype you would imagine when you think of Christianity or a Christian. That Christ is something that is applicable throughout life, and that includes the broader culture, music, art, film, the arts in general. And it's a really interesting approach. There's some great parts of this book which demonstrate God's faithfulness to Johnny Cash. As I mentioned earlier, the repeated attempts to either intentionally die or kill himself, but also the simply trying, not necessarily trying deliberately to kill himself, but exposing himself to death repeatedly, driving off cliffs, driving into a light pole, and he was repeatedly saved from these things that should have killed him, when you really think about some of the risks he engendered throughout his life. And it's really interesting the way that Greg Laurie describes the intervention of God and the hand of God on Johnny Cash's life, because most people who would assume that this was just a matter of dumb luck, that there wasn't any sort of divine providence associated with the fact that Johnny Cash survived all of these repeated self-inflicted wounds and sometimes deliberate attempts to end his life. But he demonstrates how there was an overarching theme throughout his life. Whenever he would find himself at his lowest point, there were God was there, either in the form of friends or family members, loved ones who had a relationship with Christ and pulled him out of that hole, or just his own memory and recollection of what God did for him and his family, and how he arrived at this place. So it's a really fascinating book in that respect. But it's also really interesting, even from just a personal introspective aspect, in terms of looking at the life of someone who is a legendary musician and crossed over into so many different fields and cultures. The fact that you could have someone who was a regular on Billy Graham's evangelistic crusades, the Campus Crusade for Christ, who would perform in front of thousands of Christians, and yet at the end of his career also perform to crowds of celebrities in Los Angeles. After his new work, the work that he had written in collaboration with the producer Rick Rubin, who was a rap and rock and roll producer, who was about 30 or 40 years younger than he was. The fact that he could transcend these cultures and keep a consistent, a very consistent message of the gospel is really, really amazing, and you could see it throughout his work. One of his last recorded albums that he did with Rick Rubin, he had a song entitled "The Man Comes Around," and it was a hit. It was taken from the book of Revelation. It was about the second coming of Jesus Christ and the judgment. And it's an amazing song when you actually sit down and listen to it. And it's a reminder that Johnny Cash's values, even though personally he may have wavered throughout his career and given in to temptation, that he always harkened back to his relationship with Jesus and his acknowledgement that God had provided for him, even though, as he said, he was a C+ Christian. He still remained in a relationship with Christ throughout all of this time, all of the travails, the physical and psychological and emotional turmoil that he had experienced. He still had that relationship that he could rely on. And so the biography itself is, I would say, is worth reading for that reason alone, to actually look at the life of someone who was an immensely popular, incredibly wealthy musician, but really lived his life in the end for Christ and had no regrets as he was departing the earth. Greg Laurie describes in the final chapters his increasing illness, the fact that all of these things had gradually taken a toll on him physically. His diabetes, all of the injuries that he had accumulated throughout his life, they eventually began to take a toll to the point where he wasn't even able to tour, and had to record albums in his home. But even there, even with those limitations, he was still able to have his voice heard, which is the remarkable thing. Even after he had been on his deathbed several times, he was still able to go out and put out music that spoke to your conscience and evoked feelings that really no other musician, none of his contemporaries really could. And that's one of the amazing things about Johnny Cash. And and there's an interesting part which I'll just read, the epilogue. The epilogue, from the epilogue here. It says, Jesus put it this way: "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish but have everlasting life." Johnny Cash believed that verse, and you need to as well if you want to have everlasting life and go to heaven. So, Greg Laurie, one of the reasons for this book, obviously, is to highlight what the gospel did for Johnny Cash, someone who's universally recognized as a country music and pop music icon, but also someone who put his Christianity into actually put his Christianity into use in his life and applied it from his involvement lobbying for criminal justice reform, or to remedy some of the injustices done to Native Americans, to all of the ordinary things he did for people who were hurting or people who needed help that were unspoken during his life, that he requested that not be disclosed, but that Greg Laurie discusses in this book. And one of the things that he's trying to do with this book is not only show Christianity, the value of Christianity going into the public sphere and going into the world, the use of the way that the gospel changes people, individual lives, when it's shared, but also it's written, I think, as a challenge to people who are reading it, who might be skeptical about the gospel, might be skeptical about Christ's divinity, might be skeptical about the truth claims in the Bible, and he's written the book as a challenge to these people to actually investigate, and that's one of the best part. It's probably the best part about this particular book, the way that it's written, not simply as a biography of a famous Christian, but as a spiritual biography. It weaves the gospel message into the book itself. Like I said, it's the book is filled with scripture. It's filled with verses from the Bible that explain the plight and the circumstances of people of that time, and he relates it to Johnny Cash's life. And it's not just applicable to Johnny Cash, it has universal application, because these are things, temptation, sin, redemption, these are things that are universal, that everyone can experience, and it's something that or these are things that Greg Laurie feels need to be conveyed to the widest possible audience, in fulfillment of the Great Commission to go out and make disciples of all nations. And this is one of the ways that he's attempting to do that, by highlighting the personal stories, the narrative of one particular Christian. But it's not just, as I said, it's not just a biography of a famous Christian. It's a spiritual biography that weaves the gospel into the narrative of Johnny Cash's life. So it's important, I think, to read this book. It's an interesting book, entertaining in its own right. Some of the things it reveals about Johnny Cash, about his family, about his relationships with his peers, people like Waylon Jennings and Chris Christopherson and Willie Nelson, who he collaborated with on The Highwaymen. There actually are just a load of entertaining, interesting stories that you can glean from this book, and for that, and it would be worth reading for that reason. But as I said, the more important message it's trying to convey is not just the utility, but also the necessity of sharing the good news in the public. Like I said, fulfilling the Great Commission that's described in the Gospel of Matthew, going out and making disciples. And that was something that Johnny Cash did, even though most people might think of him as a really famous musician. That was something that he took seriously, to the point where he wrote a biography, a novel about the Apostle Paul. And in many ways, his life did have certain similarities. But anyway, as I said, this is a book that's worth reading. Johnny Cash, The Redemption of an American Icon. And I would go out and check it out. Anyway, I'll see you next time on Books, Music, and News Review, and that's all for today.